So for people just coming in, there's plenty of seats on this side of the room, so if you want to walk in, and then we can get started. So those of you coming in, grab a seat. There's plenty of chairs on this side. Okay, so welcome everyone to, I think we're going to get started, so yeah. So welcome everyone to the opening for Shimon Minamikawa's Retrospective exhibition at the Vanity and at 356 Mission /356 Mission. I'm John. These are my fellow panelists. I think we'll all introduce ourselves. And it's our pleasure to welcome you here today for a discussion about the place of painting and I think the post-conceptual history of art. I'll just kind of preface our conversation by saying a little about how we found ourselves all here today. Basically, in preparation for Shimon's opening, I was talking with Asha, and he mentioned that there would be a kind of event that would include a card tournament, which took place at that table earlier. And I think there might, I guess the tarot reading, the fortune telling is kind of on break right now. But there will be sporadic fortune telling tonight as well, and also this panel. And Shimon was interested in the question of painting. He actually currently has an exhibition, participating in an exhibition in Tokyo at the Mori Art Museum, Roppongi Crossing, which is a triennial exhibition in a piece that he did with Ai Arakawa. And for that piece, they it's about kind of the place of painting. And they go to Paris, and there's various kind of interactions between the paintings that are kind of personified, but it's also about the exchange between his own painting and the painting of someone named Simon Hantai, who's a Hungarian-born, Paris-based artist. And so I think that maybe is where it got started. I wasn't sure if Shimon himself would be participating. I guess he's busy kind of recording the event. And I should also let you know that this event will be recorded, so if you could turn off your cell phones and any other distracting audio material, that might be appreciated. And I don't know if we have anything else. Maybe we'll just get started with the discussion. I guess we all kind of are prepared to exchange a few messages about what we would like to talk about. And it sounds like some of the things up on the table for discussion include the contemporaneity of art, whether it's kind of something we should aspire to. The place of painting in a commodity world. What is the subject of painting in a world where everything is kind of networked and kind of relational? What is the role of the multiple, I think was another thing that Laura specifically was interested in, like how does painting operate? Is it a kind of a container? So maybe those are some prompts. We will be having a conversation, but you should also feel free to join in as well. And I guess we'll see. We'll start. Okay. So I don't know. Does anyone want to take a stab? I don't know if it's meant to be a monologue. Oh, and we were asked to submit a few slides. So I'm not. Did you? Do you want to talk a little about the Peter Halley?
Sure, that seems like a good device. Oh, so I'm Domenick. Thanks for coming. And Peter Halley I chose. Well, I mean, this is going to force at least my kind of interests on people at the beginning by chance, I guess. But the Halley thing I was interested in, basically the way that certain tropes of kind of high postmodernism are being repeated in a contemporary context, not just in painting. And in fact, Shimon, in one of the artist statements I read online, referred to Peter Halley, which is, in my experience, fairly unusual. People don't refer to him that much he's sort of like not cited as much, I guess, even though he had such a kind of important role at a certain historical moment. So that's why I chose Halle, and I won't I don't know if you want me to continue or. Yeah, dude, that guy actually. Does anyone know who Duncan Hanna is? That one is actually a kind of obscure character who's been doing paintings in New York for a number of years. And I chose him because I was also interested in dandyism as kind of a motif, because, again, inspired by Shimon, and, well, that was the flaneur, actually, but related kind of topics of style. And I just thought, again, this looks, this guy's been doing kind of related things, mostly out of a kind of anachronistic painting style and set of interest in like kind of Edwardian England, actually. So he's been this kind of character, and he dresses like a dandy. And just painting the military ship in that capacity seemed to me like a real, maybe it's not military, maybe that was just my own reading of it, but a real imposition of style on a kind of place where it doesn't belong, which, like wanting to read that into every place, which is a kind of essential dandyism. But I don't want, I mean, I don't know how we want to skew the conversation from here. Yeah. And that's Meyer Weissman. And I chose that because of, like, speaking of repetition, like those are like screened patterns of canvas, those kind of patternings. And those is from the early 80s, 85, or mid to early 80s. So, anyway. Sorry. Yeah, please. Someone else take this. I don't remember exactly. Not a lot. And I chose that because, of course, the playing card motif.
That they're all on. So yeah, I think it was kind of interesting just to see how each of us responded to this prompt, the suggestion that Shimon kind of had for, or gave us for having this kind of what does painting mean in a post-conceptual art history, and I don't know. Should we maybe start back with the slideshow and just kind of talk about what we had picked? I mean, in some ways, it's almost like a Rorschach test. It's like, what images did you pick for this post-conceptual?
Did you pick any, John?
Yeah, I picked a group of them. So, do you want to talk about my work?
No. No, I was asked for images of my work. I did pick out some historical paintings and then asked for them to be removed, actually, because I wasn't really ready to defend them. So, because they were sort of large, iconic works, I picked that for the specific reason that they would be easy objects for us to discuss, and people would have a good reference. In a sense, I picked two very famous works. One of them was Velázquez's Las Meninas, just because it was an example of how. I guess amongst the questions I had, one of them was basically how do we even formulate appropriate questions about painting when debates about the validity of painting since the late 60s, early 70s, those debates have really brought painting itself as an endeavor into question. Is whether or not this is actually a valid course of action to take as an artist. And that it was largely displaced by a lot of the sort of discourse from the late 60s, early 70s around the American wave of conceptualism as being a way of thinking about how painting has always been a highly conceptual art form. It's there's always it's a fairly simple argument, but it was just.
Okay, I'm gonna just interject.
Yeah, please.
What if there isn't? What if there isn't any more painting? What if it actually is just a container that is holds the idea of art, and it isn't? We don't actually live in a time where people are painting.
You mean they're doing other stuff?
I mean, we're using the idea of painting. We're putting things on these things that are recognizable as art because painting is the most convenient way to say I made some art, but it's not painting anymore. It's something else.
It's the
It's
most.
like, how do you locate what is a painting?
Right,
Like,
right, which
that's
is-
why I put
Yeah.
is it like we're actually living in an age of collage and printmaking? That's the paradigm we're living in terms, like, if you think of any artist, they can fit under the rubric of collage more than the idea of painting, and the painting's more of a container that people are just shitting stuff into.
I mean, that's a complex. I like the question a lot. It's a super complex question because, I mean, what you said, like, it's the easiest way to express the idea. What was the
It's
trick
like,
you said?
or I feel like I'm readily gonna make paintings because I'm not embarrassed to say I'm gonna make some art today.
Right.
And I'm gonna be dumb about it and be like, I'm making some art, I'm stretching, you know, like that's why I make a painting. But everything's so acted and like performed in every moment because of our highly conscious nature, because of the way things have sort of progressed, that it's like sort of, I don't think we're actually making paintings anymore. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, but I'm not sure either. And this could be an endless conversation. But it's in some ways, I wouldn't say it's the easiest medium, but it's the most readily recognizable as art in some sense. Even though in some ways it's been ghettoized since, again, like the late '60s, early '70s, and particularly since like the early
Not
'80s.
more than like ceramics, though, right?
Not more than ceramics. No, that's
or
true.
maybe poetry
Or printmaking?
or printmaking.
Right.
Or opera. If we're gonna
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. Printmaking. But poetry's a slightly different one because there's always been a very, very small, ultra dedicated audience for poetry, and they're mostly poets, probably. Like free jazz or something. That was a reference to Peter Halley, if anyone's ever studied. Not with but the yeah, that's tough. I mean, are we really painting nowadays? Is such how do we even narrow that question down so we can make it make sense? Like, because I feel that all the time. Like, I mean, am I making a painting? Or it's am I even making art? It's hard. It's hard. It's like.
Well, if I could jump in, like, what is the utility of saying you're not painting, I guess, in a certain way? Like, what, like, does it, I mean,
I don't
like, there's
think
sort
you'd
of
say
the...
You're using paint. You could be using paint, but it's like...
Not making. I mean, I understand what your question to be, like, you're not engaged in a certain tradition of painting that is about kind of a certain kind of art or craftsmanship or something like that. Is that
You
one
could
way?
be, but that brings us back to the question here's ringing, which is is there a burden of contemporaneity? I don't know how to say contemporaneity. Contemporaneity.
The contemporary.
Contemporary,
Yeah.
or like what you're talking about, where you're dedicated to this craft, it's certain inhabiting a sort of performative anachronism, where you're like, I will go back to the atelier, I will learn the craft, I will dedicate myself, which is totally like an option to perform that and be that, because it's all becoming this sort of idea of performance, and the studio is like kind of exploded into this like non-space that I guess I'm frustrated with the way, because painting is a container, anything can be put on this sort of form, and it's a painting, and it can be mute and say nothing, and there's like a new like school of formalism that doesn't call itself formalism now, like that is the mute school. I don't know, like that has to do with this I think it's using this idea of container in a fashionable way.
Even just showing the container as empty.
Yeah.
A stretcher hung on the wall, without canvas even stretched over it or something. Yeah, absolutely. It's hard too, because I mean, maybe in some ways this relates to one of the questions that I posed, which was, in some ways, like how how do you paint when the history of painting itself has become a commodity? I mean, when history's become a shopping district for a type of content, for something that replaces content. And it's like when we don't, part of what makes, what calls into question painting as an activity rather than just a performed, rather than just some sort of like performed stance in the studio, is this disconnect from history? Is this like there isn't this, I guess, boy, without trying to reduce this to like the most textbook level, it's like, I mean, after World War II, there was this big split, like, you know, coming with the sort of the rise in popularity and the sort of the marketing machine behind like new American abstract expressionism, and there was this very pointed divorce from European roots. They didn't want people to think about Kandinsky when they looked at Pollock, right? So, but this sets in motion that, coupled with this idea of like painting as being this mass cultural activity, where there also is this divorce in history. So there isn't this like slow progression of ideas, like, you know, Ang decides to like subvert David by turning the rectilinear grid and putting, you know, arabesques across it, like having the arabesque as being the center of his like composition, this like central compositional technique. You know, I mean, you don't have things like that now. I mean, everyone's just like running around with their heads cut off, like groping for something to hold on, groping for something they can like pull out of the dungeon and sell, pull out of the cellar and sell on the street, and that's hard. But it also gets hard too. Sorry, I'm really rambling now. But because of the sort of devaluation or the denial of the validity of painting, this gets weird. I've gotten in super big trouble with this in grad school because having originally gone to art school in the early 90s, like I started in 1989 actually, and so it was really to say that you were a painter. I mean, it was like saying like, oh, I'm a clown for hire. I mean, it was really not respected. It was, but I liked it for that. I liked it because it was a challenge. If you were going to make a serious painting, it was really hard. You had to get over this enormous hurdle. But it gets difficult because even today, walking in the hallway of my own studio building, the building I have my studio, a friend asked me, "What have you been up to?" And I almost said, "I've been painting," and I stopped and I said, "I've been working." I changed my answer because it's like, partly because of this, like, because like, what does it mean to paint? Like, do I even know what it means to paint? I mean, I don't even feel comfortable saying that I'm making a painting, and partly it's because I don't know where that exists or how that exists, painting. It's like what are the histories we can look for? I mean, it's like Peter Halley and painting in the 80s. I thought that was a really interesting way to start this. Meyer Weissman too, but Peter Halley in particular, that's really, it was the beginning of the end. I mean, like starting with the Neo Geo and the Neo Expressionists, it was gonna be a rebirth of painting, right? Like it was gonna be like picking up painting where it dropped off somewhere in the 60s. Do you want to interject?
Yeah, I'll interject a little bit just because, I mean, there is one of the things that I thought was interesting, because I was reading about this recently. So, I mean, I do think that, in fact, what you're getting at is something that seems true, is that was the point at which, you know, with Peter Halley, who was this guy who was very influential or important in his importation of what was called French theory at the time, like Foucault and Baudrillard, and applying that to contemporary art and kind of just more cultural criticism. So he was like, he could be like the straw man if we were going to create an argument about this, for like, he's the guy whose fault it was that all happened. And so I think that in fact, what was happening was that critical discourse became a marketing tool. It became an essential aspect of selling the work in a certain way. You had to have a critical apparatus behind it. And I think, I mean, at least I would probably argue that that's where that probably starts. Because before that, if you had like conceptualism or whatever, that wasn't really, no one wanted to buy it. So they were doing that kind of stuff, but it wasn't, you know, sutured to some kind of thing that you could sell.
I actually would like to kind of maybe shift that move a little earlier, because it seems to me that one of the things that happens with conceptualism itself is that, you know, we have this kind of monolithic vision of conceptualism as turning away from painting. But I think one of the things that happens, if we look at what's happening in France in the late 1960s, for instance, with like someone like Buren and the BMPT group, I mean, they're precisely kind of they're coming from conceptualism from a place of painting, and so like they're already pronouncing the death of painting. I mean, this is kind of a trope that's kind of been happening throughout the 20th century. The death of painting is ever living. You know, it's like this kind of the thing that will not die is the death of painting. Like it just keeps dying and keeps coming back. It's like a zombie or something, right? So it's kind of like what's funny is like when Laura was talking about like, you know, painting as a kind of a container. I like the thing that kind of left to mind was like Rauschenberg and the idea of like the, you know, the flatbed, like the painting surface as in some ways just kind of like you drop stuff on it and then it contains whatever. But I think it's also related to this idea of the move from people having specific designations, so that, you know, I think that up until I don't know when, at some point, people had specific and I think to some degrees people still, like when they go to an art school, you know, like they're in this department or they're in that department, right? But in some ways, everyone is an artist first, and not like necessarily a painter or a sculptor or a video maker. Like there is that kind of conceptual shift where we've gone from people who are focused on one particular medium or one particular form of making into a kind of notion that there's a kind of generalized making that everyone participates in. Does that make sense, or does that?
Well, yeah, I guess that was kind of what I was trying to say was that people are, now that we're in a post-conceptual point, I went to Cal Arts, you know, most people went to Cal Arts or something like that. Like everyone thinks they're making art. It's just that some people are choosing to embarrass themselves or be in the tension of the market forces that painting kind of holds, like that they choose that sort of paradigm to put their art on, or they don't have a problem with it. They want to see what it, like for me early on, I mean, I really don't know where I'm with it now, but early on I always was like, I just want to see what this thing can do. Come on, you know, it's got all this supposed, you know, force behind it. Let's see if I can knock it this way and see what happens, or knock it that way and see what happens, or like, well, can it take this like bad taste and still be a painting? And that's so it's a nice place to sort of like throw shit at, you know, like, and see what happens and be really experimental. But at the same time, it has this problem, which is the problem of why, you know, that BMPT happened, is that, you know, it is the portable work of art, that it's at an auction house, and, you know, like, that's the idea of art in the most trad way, and it holds all the markers of capitalism right there. If not like the actual dollar with George Washington's face on it, it is a painting with Picasso. You know, like that is it. And so it's like, I'm gonna take the dollar and mess with it. I mean, like, that's kind of weird. I don't know. It's like,
yeah, it's interesting. It's super interesting actually to hear you say that, because like, particularly your paintings from the early '90s, when you're just getting out of grad school, are so directly that. It's like taking painting and attacking it. Like, what happens if you push it this way or knock it over this way, which is great. I mean, in some ways, this is funny, because where do you locate where this all began? And of course, people debate about this endlessly for decades, for probably 100 years now at least. Like, where does like, it's easy to point to someone like Duchamp, and Duchamp like rejecting retinal art, or in the beginning wanting to make non-retinal painting, which is a funny conundrum, like a great like mental exercise, but is in some ways super tragic. I think that a lot of that tendency to want to be an artist and want to get away from Okay, let me back up a second and just say that I feel like I've been growing extremely conservative the last few years. But I feel like this is like really problematic, wanting to get away from any kind of medium specificity. It's like that the series of Thierry Dedouv articles in the last few art forums, and he talks about this a lot. But it gets really complicated. Like, what are you going to do when you can, okay, I'm just recapitulating, like I'm synopsizing this set of articles, but what can you do? What are you going to do when you can do absolutely anything, and so can anyone else? And one of the ways to get away from that really is just sort of like grab onto a medium. Like, you want to be a sculptor, you want to be a photographer, you want to be a filmmaker, you want to do videos, whatever it is you want to do. But it's like, and just really grab onto that medium. And in some ways, it's like, it gets so conflicting for me because, like, although I couldn't admit to a friend of mine earlier that I was painting, I have been becoming more and more of a painter, like, and kind of intensely more and more of a painter the last few years, and maybe that was being at USC too. But it gets really difficult. I mean, because it's like, and also, I mean, like, the wars years have so much to do with it. Particularly, like, after World War II, you find a real huge break of people wanting to step away from. Again, I just make a big break from history, or want to step away from carrying on traditions, or just like simply taking other people's ideas and modulating those ideas, changing them, bending them, allowing those ideas to sort of grow and shift, where you have anyone from like Jean Fautrier saying that, I mean, like, that painting, the only way to keep painting alive is to like actively try to kill it, actively try to destroy it, which, I mean, he painted, so. To, like Barnett Newman just flat out saying, I can't paint the world, the world is destructive, the world destroyed Hiroshima, so I'm not going to paint a flower, because a flower ultimately leads to, this mushroom cloud, the atom bomb.
Okay, so that, is it possible to hold any resistance to capitalism and make paintings? Because I think that's the problem with, like, J.D. Thompson. Like, you have this, like, act where he's trying to actively make the painting the parts of the labor that went into it, to talk about labor and get to this idea of who made the painting, what is the painting, where's the labor, and a real resistance, like really talking to Marx, I think, in some way. And I guess at the end, you just see it as a painting. I don't think it can ever go there. It's like a kind of nominal, like. But what's more interesting about it is the fact that he made a painting that is a portrait of the making of itself, or something, in some way. That sort of reflexive ability the container has is what's interesting about it. Not that he's trying to point to, like, who is the real laborer here or something. Like, I just don't think it works. And I think that's the real problem painting has. But I'd be curious to think if anybody thought that painting can resist capitalism in any way. I don't know. And only in ideas of beauty or something? I don't know.
I was just going to say, can anything resist capitalism is kind of a really, like, I guess I would just say, it's not like people do it insincerely, or whether insincerity or sincerity is a useful, like, barometer of, like, virtue, but, it's kind of an absurd. You can try to, but you're not really going to if you're exchanging money for. I think people do make that kind of claim all the time, and it seems totally absurd to me. But it doesn't mean you can't express certain kind of political sentiments, I guess. But I do think that, just going with what you were saying about the reflexivity thing, it seems like that kind of work. Like, Thompson is like an excellent example, I think, to choose of stuff that is really just it's conceptualism, but it's realized in certain physical objects, which happen to include painting. Like, that's very much what you've been talking about, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that if you it sort of represents the kind of maybe not end point, but it's a highly developed version of the idea of, like, something having to be self-aware. Like, if it encodes all the labor, or represents all the labor that went into it, it has to, and there has been, I don't know at which point we want to say that happened, but, the impetus for an artwork to be aware of itself, and to, like, whatever that means. It's kind of a dodgy phrasing, but we can sort of assume we all know what that means, like the self-consciousness of the artwork. I would have a hard time boiling it down, but it's sort of something that, again, it's like a kind of classic postmodernist thing. That's when things became like self-conscious as objects or works.
Or even before that, I think that's one of the kind of the ideal dreams or ideal forms of modernism itself, is that it's totally transparent, and not just transparent for itself, because one of the ideas of painting being self-reflexive is that it then instills in the viewer that self-reflexivity that then, the viewer could then kind of rise to a certain form of consciousness, right? That's like, that is in modernism.
Yeah,
I think that's kind of one of...
I think when you're talking like that, I think of Pollock painting on the floor and his consciousness in that kind of act of painting, that's inherent when you put it up on the wall, you see the act.
Yeah, and that itself becomes a kind of a mode that, it's not just you appreciate the gesture for the gesture, but the gesture kind of bears some analogous relationship with the viewer's position, and can then kind of spur a kind of self-awareness of the viewer's position within kind of larger social positioning, right? But one of the things I think that still happens in painting, or what we're calling painting, or whatever you want to call it, but that it happens by other means. So, we, in our circulation of kind of like exchange, pre-exchange, exchange, one of the things that I kind of, was going from Shimon's original piece that is part of the show in Roppongi Crossing, and that some of his other things, is, I think what happens now is that painters are extremely self-aware, Snoopy included, but rather than kind of, being able to presume that a shared context for understanding that self-awareness, I think there's like almost a self-contextualization that happens.
I also think like that leads that self-awareness has, I think, been around, but just growing in some way, but now has led to like real admission of the sort of like non-author that is in the studio, the one that is painting. And I think that's why I think it's interesting to think about these ideas of the multiple, because it's like sort of enunciates like this like non-author author or something that's like just making, or like with Merlin Carpenter's show at Overeating Kite, where there's a press release that stands in for like a kind of idea that his assistant traded him an original for 12 or 16 copies or something, or Warhol's shadow paintings. But I think now younger artists, the more interesting ones are, to me, like thinking in this way that like it's like who makes it. I don't know, it's like they're very conscious in a way that they get to play around with who makes it, like who they are that day making it, and like the multiple being one. And like I really like Jonathan Horowitz's project where he had the assistants paint the Liechtenstein mirror. It's like, I think that's interesting. I don't know. You're not into the multiple?
No. I just there's just a lot in the conversation to sort of like digest.
Actually, I have one question. Actually, since pursuant to this, which is, like, I was very curious about the way you were talking about the non-author, and like, were you? Is it sort of like the person in the studio could be different each day? Or was you talking about like within an individual
that's been going
multiple?
on for a long time, yeah.
Yeah, I was just like, is that what you mean?
The funny thing is when people come in and perform themselves every day, and it's like becomes this sort of hackneyed thing. It's like, and sometimes some way to kind of talk to the audience about that kind of performing of the self is through the multiple, like, or something that like speaks to the multiple, because it's like, oh yeah, and then I did this, and then I did this, and I did this, and of course, there's like a slight irony to it that I think is interesting. And whereas like when you have someone performing a sort of unself-consciousness that speaks back to modernism and the romantic ideas, maybe that'll get interesting again. I don't know.
Okay, so I guess I don't quite understand. No, it's not that I don't quite understand. Maybe I just disagree a little bit. Self-consciousness has been a self-consciousness in the artwork and on the part of the the artist has been like a main starting point for art throughout all art history. I mean, it's like, what is a painting if it's not, or a book, or whatever, if it's not a person in the world being conscious of them in relationship to the world and other people. I mean, you could have no painting without a sense of self, and every painting, I mean, it's like, okay, so I mean, I had this big interest in like Dutch flower painting because it was part of my thesis from grad school. But one of the things that struck me so much about, you know, like paintings from the early 17th century, particularly these flower still lifes, is that these like Dutch flower still lifes were so extremely self-conscious and so pointedly bizarre. And part of their point was to bring up a certain kind of memento mori, vanitas, self-consciousness in the consumer. It's pretty complicated, I mean, because you're buying this very expensive thing and you're supposed to be buying it to remind yourself that buying expensive things is folly. But that is like an enormously, like a very, very complex and very evolved sense of self-consciousness. And so it's not so much that. I mean, it's like okay. So the other thing about like Horowitz's pieces, I think that's a great project, and I like that show. But that's in some ways, oh boy, not to make a damning statement, because I do like that project, but I think it's a symptom of like a greater problem. But again, in some ways, I would really locate like post World War II, like mid 20th century. We're still living such a mid 20th century world. Sometimes makes me dizzy sometimes, but it's like you know, like all these things about like again, like Barnett Newman, wanting to like get away from the world and show only like a human presence, or John Cage's his insistence on using chance operations so that he could get away from the self. In some ways, it's like it's great, like it's wanting to get away from a performing of the self, a monotonous performing of the self, but it's also, I feel like it comes out of this like place of hurt, this like place of like unsure distrust of the self, so that the subjective is like put aside, so that you can still continue in the world without having the burden of like maybe being wrong or maybe blowing up some cities in a foreign country, kind of, you know what I mean? It's like it's like that kind of burden that in some ways I think we need to not get over, but we need to heal to move, if we want to move forward, if we want to make artwork that isn't just a means for advancing capitalism into like further corners of life, you know what I mean? Maybe not.
Well, actually,
I don't know.
well, I was just going to say, I mean, I was just going to say one thing which struck me, like you've come back to a couple times actually, which is the post-war thing and the basically the bomb, right? I mean, that's sort of where that goes, because like we have now the capacity to destroy ourselves, or yes, the, you know, no music, whatever that was, no poetry after Auschwitz. But you know, so like that as a symbol of our ability to like destroy ourselves. But I do think that it's different, because now I think there's generally a sense that we are destroying ourselves, or possibly are in the point of no return in terms of that process. I mean, that's a bit bleak, but I do think that there's a real, just a bit, but I do think it's, that kind of distinguishes the maybe nihilism of this period, if you again want to go that far, versus this potentially redemptive, you know, possibility that they may have felt at that point. I don't know. That's just like a total speculation.
No, I mean, again, I was just like looking for a place to sort of locate a beginning. Like, how do you even start talking about this condition? Like, where do you see, like, where do these symptoms stem from? Like, what was? In some ways, I just see like that was sort of an axe wound, and that's where the infection starts, sort of, or something. I mean, there's many places to point. It's just, I don't know. It's like, but how did we like we started off in the very beginning with, how do we get to this place where painting is really not painting anymore, or making art's not really making art anymore? It's always doing something else, and the art is an artifact of that performance. Like, and where did that all start? I mean, in some ways, I think I'm coming at it from the wrong side, because I see that as a largely negative attribute to sort of contemporary art making in some ways, because it really makes it difficult to move with a clear conscience. That's not really what I mean. It makes it very difficult to do much of anything except for shop history, sort of. It's like, makes it very difficult to do anything other than make a consumer object. In some ways, like, I'm most interested in making artworks that can function in a sort of traditional artistic, sort of like an aesthetic philosophical way, like something that reflects back on how people relate to the world in some ways.
We actually have a question. Maybe. Should we just repeat it? Okay. Could you ask and I'll repeat the question?
You'll repeat it?
Yeah.
Okay. It might get a little confused as I ask it, but
Okay.
so as
Take
you're
notes.
discussing as you're talking about painting and it's basically I'm wondering if you could differentiate, if it's useful or necessary to differentiate between like a mode of production and then process in terms of both like what those are historically mean terms, but also is like the path to making of painting. And then how if those relate at all to legibility of that painting. And then also like in the arguing versus like yes, I mean whoever is painting who is painting what is or isn't, there has to be that kind of that it requires that kind of action to get there. I'm wondering if that how do you think that affects legibility? And
The
also,
action being distinguishing between the.
I mean, I don't know. And when I was thinking, I thought initially a process, and then I was like, oh, I guess, it could be related to production mode, but then also just in terms of that does affect the legibility of artwork as a painting or not. And then also just in terms of painting as a visual, like we need to bring into the discussion.
I'm sorry.
Maybe bringing into the discussion, or I'm curious about, it is a visual language that is kind of earlier than other types of visual language and representation, and how that maybe affects the history and that maybe point of how it's something legible as this object, but it's also got its path to becoming that.
Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize that. So basically the question was, with regard to painting, if we should differentiate between painting as a mode of production as opposed to painting as a process, or
other terms, those are two
or other possible terms, and how those distinctions or differentiations affect our painting's legibility for us.
as a painting or an object.
Yeah, as something, right? As a thing, as a painting, as an object, whatever.
And maybe within the time period constraints that you've been talking about, or maybe within the domains of discourses, sure.
Okay, and then the second part of what you were saying was also concerns painting as itself, a thing with a history that's longer than maybe some other art forms,
Right,
and how that affects
sure.
the discussion.
I could add a third point.
Okay, go for it.
Right, what if we make it like Abby Warburg's legibility of like a history and visual language, and then add it to it?
Okay, so adding Abby Warburg into the mix. Okay.
I guess I was going to add to the question a little bit, like with the question, which is just, do you think painting was the paradigm with which like we got where we are? So it's inside of all the art we're looking at now anyway. So it's sort of like it went inside of everything, sort of made everything. I mean, affected sculpture and I don't know.
When would that have happened, do you think?
I don't know.
I mean,
Maybe not, maybe
I mean,
not.
I guess I kind of think like maybe the answer is yes. Is that painting is like in some ways maybe the most.
For the idea of art, like
yeah.
if we're gonna not be talking about the Greeks and all that, like if we're
Yeah.
gonna talk about the idea of art that we could talk about as art, like the painting was the kind of primary, and then it like got sort of like expanded into this field of all the other shit, and then that all shit got made, and now that shit's using painting as a container. Do you know what I mean? 'Cause
now,
it's now
things are just really shitty.
Yeah. But you think you got to remind us of the question, because I was just thinking of that part of it. I don't remember the other three parts of her.
Oh, okay. So, going back to the question. Okay, painting as a mode of production versus as a process, and how it affects the legibility of painting, and also painting as kind of as something with that history, that kind of maybe is a little longer than say video or
Oh,
film.
like its long language gives its all
it has a tradition, I guess, that it could be situated in, even if it doesn't always get situated within that. Is that one?
Seems like it's not working in its favor at this point in time, though, right? I mean, this sort of depth of meaning that one can grab from with like all the history of painting, like it seems like a kind of like sad fact that no one cares about. Like,
Well,
That,
go ahead.
yeah. Well, what do you mean no one cares about?
okay, a few people maybe, but that's sort of like not what's interesting about it.
But do you mean like the
think
the
John's gonna
history
get
of
me.
painting itself? Like, I mean, what do you mean? What don't they care about? I'm just trying to get.
Oh,
make
the
sure.
long history that like
Uh-huh.
John has been alluding
Uh-huh.
to in terms of like pictorial language that has talked to one painting to another. When like the first kind of impasto brushstroke stood up to be mean a realistic image, and you know like what the history of the shadow and just these things that like for the nerds that's all cool. But,
Well,
like,
you
that's
care
not-
about them, right? So I think
But I don't know if
people on the
that
panel.
language like is not working in terms of like contemporary art museums. Like if you go into a contemporary art museum, no one's thinking about the history of the language of painting. I mean, that's just not.
Yeah, that's a funny thing. That's something I think about a lot.
They're
lately.
thinking about. I'd say they're thinking about minimalism. If you're gonna pick one thing, it's like, how is this minimalism? Is like the dominant language of, right? I'm just throwing that out there.
I'm not sure I would actually say that it is the dominant mode. I mean, you know, when you say that there isn't, I'm not saying that, you know, like, I mean, painting is a very heterogeneous form, right? So we have someone like Kahinda Wiley who's making paintings that, at least on their surface, are gesturing at history, even if they aren't really historical in some ways. I feel like, you know, they are very of their moment. But they are kind of appropriating a kind of historical language to make that point. But I granted.
And they're introducing it to people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like that language is a
It's not
fluid
sustained.
language.
Yeah.
So I think like the history of video is probably the same as the history of painting right now, right? I mean, I just don't think people are.
Yeah, this idea. Okay, yeah. I mean, I think that's always.
Well, do you want to finish your thought and then we'll get. Yeah.
Sure, you can take the question actually, but I mean, I think I just want to say like, I think that painting has always been for nerds, and I think that it's a real problem. Just as like every art form has always been for, you know, its particular. You know, it's particularly consuming audience. It's like, and it's part of like, again, like not to keep hitting mid 20th century, except for I think we're still living in the mid 20th century. It is that it's when art had to start becoming, not just with pop art, but with like ABEX, when artwork started having to become this make mass cultural statements, you all of a sudden were not talking to nerds anymore. You were talking to people with very, very broad interests, and you had to say something to all of them. And this is something I'm actually stealing
Also,
from.
it also was the time. I mean, I'm imagining the Life magazine and Pollock performing, and this sort of romantic idea of the American, all that coming out at the time you're talking at, and that also is not a nerd. I mean, that's like the anti-nerd. That's like so that creates this other.
Well, I'd also like to just point out that, sorry, this should really not hold the. So in some ways, I mean, I feel like painting isn't, or art, you know, isn't necessarily like, it didn't just begin to be a mass consumer thing in the mid 20th century. I mean, if you think about the salon exhibitions in the 19th century, you know, the population was much smaller, but the average salon was attended by 1 million unique visitors. You know, and that in itself is kind of fairly phenomenal when you consider that today, like what we think of as like the mass consumer form of the blockbuster exhibition, a good blockbuster exhibition will get a few 100,000 visitors. You know, and so it's like I think there's a nuance to be, you know, to be made about like mass consumer. What does it mean for painting to, you know, I'm not sure it just recently became mass consumer, you know, and in some ways painting is like interesting because it gets consumed via its images, but it still has that part of what makes it appealing or kind of special, and it gives it its specialness is that it can't be mass consumed. It's kind of, it belongs to one person, right? Like in some ways. I mean, it has a kind of funny, anyway. But maybe we can take our question.
That sort of relates to my question. I wanted to ask Laura to talk more about the multiple, because I think one of the weird things about paintings that are still is, I kind of get worried sometimes with age of innovation and iterations of all types, that even when we put forth an original painting, but from one person, it operates as if it's multiple. We're just we consume the information so quickly, perhaps.
Have you seen that blog, The Same Painting? I was gonna try to show that, but it's basically like 100 different people's painting that all looks pretty much the same. And I think of that blog as being about the multiple. It's just made by a lot of people, so that person has culled the multiple digitally online to show us the multiple, and it sort of speaks to a democratic idea of art where anyone can make. Are you gonna find it? It's a Tumblr. Yeah. So I guess I feel like fear not your lack of originality. Embrace the multiple. Embrace your ability to remake your neighbor's art. That is where we're at, and just you do it emphatically and do it without shame.
I mean, does it also have to do with like the fact that there possibly, and I don't have statistics to prove this, but it seems like there are probably a lot of people making art right now, perhaps more than were in previous times, and because information spreads so quickly, and people go to the same schools and have generally speaking
And now they
similar canons.
we've flattened everything by everyone looking at the same blogs. So these grad students, literally, it's one grad school in all nations at all times. There is nothing happening in Ohio that's not happening at UCLA. It's just all the same. Sorry.
But no, I think it's. I mean, yeah, I think that's. Well, then the question is, how do you produce variation, or or as there's, on the other hand, the multiple is to be embraced, but like, where does innovation break into the system? Or innovation being, of course, a very loaded
Well, that's
term,
what we were talking
but
about when you came in.
difference.
I was saying, you're talking about avant-gardism. I was like, come on, no one believes in that shit anymore. And you're like, what? I don't know, maybe they do.
I don't know, maybe they do. I don't know. Well, don't you think these people think they're doing?
No,
well, they
I don't think. No, I think they're just making something. Don't you think? I don't know. They're making something, not like this is it. I will now show the world where the next direction we are headed. It's not that.
No.
Come on, no way.
Well, I don't think anyone thinks they're like the world's great innovator, but I think like the criteria for making
I really tried to figure this out. The last avant-gardist tendency artist, I think, was like Maurizio Catalan or something. I think he was really trying to like overthrow something. And it didn't work so well. I don't know. I was like rooting for him to do it, but I mean, Tina Segala maybe is trying, I don't know, the resistance of something, but it's like anyone making a painting now, I really find it hard to believe you're being avant-garde. I mean, that's just a joke. I mean.
Yeah, but people still, you have to make a claim that you're doing something kind of novel, like putting your own little twist.
No, that's the whole point. No,
I don't think that's
a romantic idea.
I mean, it's true, but I think that maybe it's just because all I do is read press releases and not look at blogs.
Oh yeah, no, they definitely want to sell you the idea. Yes, and maybe a confluence of ingredients of something called something else. But in the studio, I think all good artists know they're just making shit. They're just making stuff.
It's not just art, right? Like I remember a philosopher I was talking to basically was like, there's only about 3 ideas in the world, and everything just is recycling those 3 ideas.
Or recombining them, or re-showing them in a new way, in a funny way, in a dark way. And I think it's interesting. It's like about being alive and about representing like, I lived today, I marked myself, I marked here, that kind of thing. And that's great, but I don't think, I think avant-gardism is not. If it could happen, it's like all those ideas about, I don't want to get into it, but
Well, I think that, my take on it is that there's in some senses a contradiction, because I think, up until, let's say, somewhere in the 19th century, maybe 20th century, people were comfortable living within a tradition and living within the idea that they were extending a tradition. And at some point, we have this notion of, the romantic notion of avant-gardism, where it became kind of the value of art was to find the novelty or the new, right? And we still, in some ways, artists, even if they don't necessarily think they're going to hit the jackpot, they still believe in it.
It was also manifestos like Breton and that, like where they're really like hitting hard to like overthrow those guys over there.
Yeah.
Which I feel like now no one is trying to overthrow the group that lives in Culver City or the group that lives on Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Like no one cares about the little groups that are happening.
But I don't think we found a language to describe this kind of situation that we're in, where we aren't living in the new.
I got the language. Everyone gets to play for 15 minutes. It's the new parenting model. It's like there's no soccer. Soccer is not about like only the good kids play soccer anymore. I don't know if you know this. Like, every kid gets to play. Every kid gets to play. It's egalitarian. It's totally egalitarian, and that's what we're living in. It's like it's egalitarian. Like, here's a little of this. They're doing a little of this over here. This is over here, and no one is gonna stand up and be like, "This is shit. Put it away. These people need to be fired. Not an artist anymore. Goodbye." Like no one's doing that.
Domenick, aren't you a critic? Don't you get to do that?
Don't you get to do that? No, I'm afraid of making enemies, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I think that's symptomatic. That is very symptomatic of the whole problem, to be honest. We're all colluding together, and well, actually, there was something in the New York Times about like how book reviews are like the home of the kind of I can't think of the term, but when you write a horribly harsh negative review of someone. And that, I was like, wow, that happens in book reviews. It's true, but you never read art reviews that are like that so much. I mean, rarely do people.
But do you think it's because people are so conscious of reading into things that they're like they know the artist? I think they would psychoanalyze it and be like, whoa, he had a little axe. It's like that people feel like shit. That's gonna reveal my hatred of something that they want to cloak themselves and not show their Freudian.
Except if you're Jerry Saltz.
Right.
Yeah. I think we have just a little bit of time, so I'd like to encourage anyone in the audience who has questions to ask, or we can continue speaking. Back there.
I wanted to bring up a point about the Tumblr and just sort of not necessarily optimistic point of view of it, but just more of a way to bring back we're talking there's a mention of humility or embarrassment a little bit. And I think it's just really important to think, or I was at least thinking when I was looking at it, that maybe none of these paintings are the same. They're not. They're all very different. And I think that that's kind of what that Tumblr brings up in a way. That you can go there and say, oh, this is the same painting. They're all incredibly so different. And it even kind of has its own progression when you switch into the different, areas of if you're on the first page or the second page.
I think it's poignant in a way, what you're saying sort of relates to the show Sturtevant that's up in some of her earlier work, where she's dealing with this idea of repetition and sort of repainting a study of, Warhol or whatever. And it's obviously very different, but it's obviously about the sort of repetition. So, yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think through sameness you look at difference, and you get the kind of who is with Sturtevant, especially you get this sort of who is Sturtevant, what is she trying to do, and.
Well, we certainly have this kind of culture of individuality and the language of individuality. So even if everyone is doing something that resembles each other, I think everyone wants to think that what they're doing has that difference or believes that, right?
Yeah, that's a weird issue actually, because it's when I have taught that it's that's one of the biggest fears of students, in undergrad or whatever. It's everyone's fear in some ways, is that they're afraid that they look like someone. Like one of my students said, "Oh, I'm afraid that my paintings are exactly like Laura Owens." I was like, "They're not." And even if they were, don't worry about it. That's a jumping off point. if anything else. And it's like it's interesting because like the Tumblr, or what was that magazine? Oh wow, it started in like the late '90s. It was like New American Painting or something. What was it called? Damn. But it was just, you flip through and just like it's like the paintings are all the same. They're like everybody's paintings, and it's just a bunch of people. It's like very loosely curated. But in some ways it's like I wish that I could believe if this led to some kind of like everybody being able to play soccer could lead to this utopia where we could just like all play soccer and have fun and it was great and we didn't have to worry about it anymore, then that would be wonderful. But it doesn't really strike me as that. That's such a big part of it. This idea that we all need to be.
No, it's like feel-good capitalism.
Right.
That's what it is. It's
but
not.
And that's what I in some ways I totally agree with you, Laura, that they are. This is like a lot of this. It's making a painting that's good enough to be recognized as being an artist in some ways. Like a lot of this repetition, but in some ways, like it's also such a huge problem being afraid of repeating the past, and like afraid of repeating the past in a way so much so that you want to make a break from it, and that you don't have something. I mean, you mentioned the avant-garde, and who was the last avant-garde? In some ways, I would want to argue that the very first avant-garde, that Kazimir Malevich, that Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque were the last avant-garde. It's like once you make such a huge break, once you make such a huge shift in your mode of production, like 1915, Kazimir Malevich, like black on white, like how do you paint after that? You can't paint after that. You can't progress from there. You've already gotten to the very, I mean, yes, you can.
He certainly did.
What?
He certainly did.
Yeah, no, he did, but he had trouble from within and without. But I mean, it's like, yeah, you could be, Helen Frankenthaler, you can stain the canvas, and as like Clement Greenberg would talk about, like that would be the next big step in painting, is just color mixed with canvas. But that's not, I mean, that's such a subtle modulation. It gets difficult, like, I think in some ways I feel like it's the avant-garde expectations that make painting that make painter making art at all so problematic now. It's like because everyone feels like they have to make their own personal statement, and it's got to be the biggest break from all of history possible ever. And that's such a crazy, super ultra modernist expectation, and it also works into because everyone wants you to make that big break from all of history so they can sell it and cash in on it. And it's like Cezanne wanted to be, I'm picking a lot on the 19th century too, but Cezanne wanted to be as good as his predecessors. He would look at whoever, I'm blanking on everybody's name right now. But he just wished that he could be as good, rather than saying I'm not going to erase all history. He wanted to be a part of this tradition of making something powerful in some ways, not trump all, not this very sort of Adorno-esque I want to make the artwork that trumps all artwork, and no artwork will ever exist before or after it. That is super modernist. That's super, and it's very, very 20th century. Yeah, it's part of this whole conundrum, part of the whole mix of why we are painting in a post. What's the condition? The post-conceptual.
No, I think it was on the flyer. Post-conceptual.
Yeah.
Talked at all about post-conceptual. The title should be more about painting after modernism. I feel like you're throwing painting into conceptual art, where you have really differential quality. What is the proposition contemporarily for painting after conceptual art?
Where do they even split? Why is there a difference between painting and conceptual art? That was one of my earliest questions. How are they even different? How are they ever different, and why are they different now?
Well, I mean, there are two completely different movements. Modern painting,
They have different names.
conceptual art.
Well, I mean, modern art's not exactly a movement per se, and I would actually argue that conceptualism is kind of folded within modernism itself. So, we can kind of quibble about that. But I take your point that, the discussion hasn't been laser focused on this kind of idea of post-conceptual painting, or what is painting after conceptual art. And I would just kind of maybe, re-emphasize something that I said earlier, which is that, like in some ways I feel that one of the things that does happen in post-conceptual painting specifically is this greater emphasis on self-contextualization and narrativization. So I feel like what Shimon is doing in his work, where it's kind of not just about making a painting, but also kind of not even necessarily laying bare, in this kind of like modernist way of how the painting got made, but then like creating a context for the painting. That's something that is particularly post-conceptual in its strategy. Another way that, we haven't talked as much about, although I think we touched on with the idea of the multiple, is the idea of the delegated painting. So, it's not that the artist is the author, but that the painting gets made by someone else, and it's kind of de-emphasizing the labor, the handicraft of painting itself.
Yeah, I thought with Jonathan Horowitz, I was sort of trying to say that.
You don't think that an individual can take a conceptual route out medium systems or, making a work solely on their own. And like Laura's talking about the anxiety on art that doesn't exist. Maybe it does, but it seems like a lot of discussions revolving around people, like there are painters that are spent on selling art. Or there are tons of painters that are making work religiously, just so they can paint. It's not about Marxism or going against the anti-corporate or going against corporal.
They're doing it because it's their job.
Or they're doing it because that's what they
Want to do, yeah.
Just make art or make paintings because they're interested in the history of painting. You said like going to the museum, people don't think about history, but
I was thinking about the long language of history of painting, the language within painting. I feel like it's really lost.
I thought something else about what you were saying, like you don't want to go to the Greek, like you don't want to talk about the Greeks, you go.
Because I don't think the Greeks had our same idea of what art is, where it's this, we have a sort of,
They don't have art was not a word, it was not a
Yeah, so
concept.
I just feel like we're talking like painting was started like 60 years ago or something. I mean, he brought up some old people, but
Oh,
I feel like you're gonna
I think we're
talk
talking.
about
I think it's my fault, and I was talking about how painting ended 60 years ago, but not rather than started.
Yeah.
The problem started. That's my fault. It's not their fault.
It seems that the cool thing about this notion of post-conceptual is that at this point we now have a nice distance, where like maybe if the painting is a container of ideas for art, and there was this conceptual movement that wanted to get away from objects, free up some of the market idea of art and idea being contained in objects. So then they started to broaden out and look at institutions and installations. But now we're at this place where having some distance of people working using those methods, I can sort of look at early 70s works as being kind of like if you were to repeat some of those things, they're really romantic, sweet, and like you can find hypocrisy in how they are supported and how they, you can constantly tear down the institution, and it's not as interesting. So being a painter, and at this point, like being at art school today, I don't know what the kids are thinking, but it seems like a good time to be able to say like I can think my ideas and work out ideas and have ideas within this. Maybe I haven't been around in art school for a while, but it seems much more legitimate like that. You can have investigation and explore ideas in this medium that does have all of this baggage and history, but
yeah, no, I think when you first started, you talked about like the cringiness of painting in the 90s. I don't think
No, not at
people
all.
who are younger don't understand what that was like at all.
well, good for them, I mean, it's like, Do you like? Is there a reason to kind of continue to cringe?
Maybe just that twinge of pain saying you're a painter is like that last twinge of remembering what painting may have actually been. Just to be really dark.
But also really romantic.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm totally into romance. There were other questions.
I think this is the end music.
We're getting the signal. So, well, on that ultra dark, ultra romantic note, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and thank you to our panelists.